Hi, this is Paul. What I'm about to play is part of a 5-hour live stream that happened on the new attempts to better coordinate and consolidate some of the little just chatting streams that are going on some of the smaller channels in this little corner of the internet. As some of you may know, Pastor Mo from Chicago, he's a Christian Reformed church planter, has been working with Jacob to sort of put together a foundation and add a little bit more coordination with a lot of the conversations. The Randos United channel has sort of been redefined, and a lot of the chatting is moving away from Jacob Federecci's channel into the Randos United channel, a little bit more of an independent space so that Jacob can use his channel for whatever Jacob wishes to use his channel for. And Jacob was on and Sam was on, so I decided to jump in, and what developed was really a pretty amazing conversation about the challenges going on in church. Sam shared a few things that he's dealing with in terms of relating to his local church. CW shared some of his story with respect to relationships with local churches. Part of what has marked this little corner for a long time has been difficulties in terms of relating to local churches. And as a pastor, I can tell you that pastoring a local church is getting harder and harder. And one of the things that there's a whole host of reasons for that, but one of the things that Sam really highlighted here is the rise of the autodidact. And what do we mean by that? People are getting better and better educated in all sorts of things. Sam, of course, is a biblical Unitarian, and anyone who wants to sort of take on Sam with respect to the Trinity is going to have their hands full, because Sam is very well read, especially in this area. This happens a lot with individuals who are intelligent, well educated, have access to the internet, have access to Amazon. They can very quickly become experts in one little portion of, let's say, Christian theology. And then, of course, in a local church, it's led by a pastor who may have some theological education, elders who likely don't have theological education. They're ensconced in a tradition that has propositional formulations of their situation. They may or may not be attached to larger denominations that both sort of hold the theological propositions in a group. And, well, how does that go? I suspect, I can't know this, of course, but I suspect that especially before the Protestant Reformation, people had, if you were marginally literate, lived in a town, books were enormously expensive. Most of the propositional information you would get would simply be a part of your culture. Now, of course, there were extremely cosmopolitan times and places in the world. You can think about the Roman Empire. You can think about some of these major urban areas in the Roman Empire. And there, of course, I'm sure were very learned people, and you had to sort of figure out how to deal with that in church. And a lot of what that produced were a lot of fightings and warrings in churches that sometimes would spill out into bloodshed. And this, of course, went on through the Protestant Reformation, the bitter wars between Catholics and Protestants, the treatment in Europe of Jews at Protestant hands. I mean, in terms of grievances, we could, of course, everybody can stake their case. But we are now in an age where, in fact, praise God, we are not killing each other over these things right now, or at least right here. Part of what's been a real treasure in this little corner of the internet is to try to have a variety of good faith conversations all over the map. And even on this page, you've got Jonathan, who's now a Noahide in Grand Rapids, Michigan, of all places. We've got CW, who's in Minnesota, and he's got his own interesting story. And again, CW, very much someone who's a a theology nerd in Reformed theology and a whole bunch of other readings. You've got Richard, who grew up in going to a Christian Reformed school in Washington State, now studying in Biola, but worshiping with Orthodox. You've got Jacob and his own, I won't go into his own particular religious story. You've got Hezi in Israel, who always sucks me in when we begin to talk about all of these elements of church and state issues that arise with the state of Israel. You've got Chad the alcoholic, who worships with Lutherans, but has obviously his own story deeply shaped by recovery. Charlie is, as talked about in this live stream a little bit, he's preparing for church leadership, and Hezi really nicely sort of puts him on the spot and says, you're preparing for leadership, but you're listening to both people who are in the church and struggling with the church, and you're looking at church leaders who, maybe they just really hope that nobody who knows more about, well, that's absolutely impossible. Another conversation that I've seen happen many times has been clergy who have, I display my ignorance all the time on this channel, clergy who know some things about some things, but are not theologians, being necessarily scholars in a particular field, or then they have to talk about ethics, they have to talk about technology, they have to talk about whole ranges of things, and you've got all kinds of people in their churches, and figuring out how this all works together. And how, propositional formulations of truth and theology are definitely not going away, partly simply because of their utility in helping group people together historically. But what's going to happen to that as modernity recedes? How can we, in fact, figure out how to live together productively and how to seek God with all of our hearts, with all of our different convictions, and not just in sort of a, good fences make good neighbors sort of way, but a way that really gets at what I think drives a lot of us to this little corner. I think many of us in this little corner are in some ways exiled by this larger process, and we don't quite know what to do about it or to do with it. There's spats between groups, but you look at most of the people who, let's say, have their own channels that are active in this little corner. You think about Grail Country, you think about Jacob, you think about Karen and the Meaning Code, you think about Sevilla, you think about, all of these different channels. You talk to a guy like Nate, who's so incredibly well read, and now he's pulling in new theologians and pastors to have conversation, and it's tremendously daunting because nobody has time to read everything. And so we're trying to synthesize and come up with a worldview and live together and figure out how to do worship, and it's a tremendously challenging space. So I just wanted to put this little preamble onto this about an hour's worth of video that I took from the live stream, and to give a little bit of orientation for it. Of course, if you want to listen to all 5 hours, you can. Those of you who have spent any time playing with the new Just Chatting practice that we have sort of developed lately can of course jump in and do so anywhere. To me, it's been a real delight. I caught a little bit of Pastor Mo and Tayo and Lost Cause chatting while Lost Cause was doing some drywall work, and Tayo, of course, wonderful guy who I met in the UK, has 2 estuary groups, one in Birmingham and one in Manchester. And of course, Pastor Mo, a CRC church planter in Chicago. So, yeah. And I know, when I was having this conversation, I was thinking about many of you who really wrestle with this. I was thinking about some of you who might think you might like to go to church, but you seem to have, and understandably so, very little confidence that any church could fit you. for a host of different reasons. We have all been so deeply impacted by particular idiosyncratic beliefs and experiences that make it difficult for some to sort of fit into a church. I continue to have really significant conversations in the Christian Reformed space. The Christian Reformed Church, not just Living Stones, but churches are struggling mightily. Pastors and church leaders are really trying to figure out what to do. And, in many ways, a lot of those struggles are the impetus for this channel, because I don't just need to talk about this among colleagues in the Christian Reformed Church. The world is enormously broad, and it's not just Sacramento. It's a big world out there, and even this little corner is only one little portion of the world. And so I find conversations like these so immensely important and helpful in listening and hearing and shaping and trying to figure out not just how to relate to other denizens of the corner via Zoom or YouTube or Discord or any of these channels, but to figure out how this impacts ministry in my local church as well. So here's the conversation. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did.
But to have a little bit of understanding that people have fought over the centuries for over many things that we today look at and say, why did they kill over that? It's usually not the only thing that was in play.
When I look at this, and I can't ignore the fact that there's also Jonathan's over here, and I wonder to myself, again, as a Jew, seeing things through my narrative, how there becomes more of unification between Jews and Christians. And then looking at someone like Sam, and I know he's telling Jacob, he's disagreeing with Jacob, but I would say that Jacob and I look at Sam as like and I'm sorry if this is offensive, but like a data point of how a fusion like that could happen. But like when I look at someone like Sam, I wonder to myself, is that what we require to sort of dig back and look down and reread and see, maybe our Christian brothers are looking at things this way. And then that's already a much more cohesive language that Jacob is saying, well, of course, you're being kicked out of the church because like you're sounding a lot more like me. And the conversation like me is that doesn't jive well. But I understand that what Sam is saying, he's like, well, it should jive well because you should in theory notice the difference, but the tension is there.
Part of why I do what I do, and part of why I have the approach that I have, certainly part of it is that I'm high in openness. But there are other reasons for this. How I live my life as compared to Sam. Let's say if someone had a video camera of following me and following Sam along all day long, or someone was watching the way we spend our money, or someone was watching how we interacted with our children, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Jacob's point that, well, this theology has consequences. I'm not going to argue against that. It certainly does. But there are many other layers as well that we are participating in of American culture, of the way that technology has moved and shaped how we live today. One of the nice pieces I got from my mother was something written by my grandmother describing Grand Rapids at the beginning of the 20th century, how her mother would go out, she'd dress herself up, she'd take an axe, and she'd go down to chop the water off of the river to haul water in order to wash clothes. And she would spend a day or two a week just washing clothes. There's so many layers of this that we are dealing with now. And that is not to in any way sort of say that the theological doesn't count or isn't an important layer in that stack. But when we're talking with each other, there are many, many layers in stacks today that likely weren't the way they were even 100 or 200 or much less 2,000 years ago. And so when it comes to how we relate to one another, it bears, I would rather lead with the teaching of Jesus that we love our neighbors, as we love ourselves, and that goes all the way up to and including our enemies. And so figuring out how to love one's enemies is a really important and difficult thing. But that is, I think, part of what we are called to do. And that includes our theological adversaries from centuries ago, which makes, for me, just look at the astounding level of diversity we have in these little 8 squares right now 9. I mean, and some of the hottest disagreements. I mean, when Jacob was up here in Sacramento, when Jacob's up, I take the opportunity to quiz him about all sorts of things about Zionism. Tell me about the history of Zionism. Tell me about your disagreements with Hezi, because I'm very interested in that. I'm interested in all of these things.
Because he loves it when I quote the Satmar Rebbe and say that the modern state of Israel is Ma'aseh Satan Hitzliach.
Okay, so Jacob's speaking in tongues again. But part of what we are doing now is we are in this process of negotiation. We are figuring out how to love one another. And again, in the bigger picture, where we talked, with Hezi about, sort of the great American experiment. We are part of this great American experiment of pluralism and trying to figure out, okay, how can we live together? How can we live together productively? And, these questions of the state of Israel that Hezi keeps bringing to our corner, which I find endlessly fascinating, because, okay, where in the stack is carrying bread on the Sabbath to people in the hospital? Where on the stack is Sabbath observance, or maybe New Jersey blue laws that I grew up with? Now, how do we, with all of these layers that we have going, how do we, again, I come at this as a Christian, and so, I forefront Jesus. How do we love one another? How do we love one another well? And so, I, as a Protestant minister, I can't answer for, Scott. I can't answer for, I can understand some of, the concerns that, let's say, Sam's church leadership has. I certainly understand some of that. But, at the same time, I don't find that they are loving Sam well, even as he is a political adversary. And I don't understand how, his wife's service in the nursery or Sam's service on the piano makes sense in terms of, but they have to deal with their own house. I don't have to answer for that. So too much talking.
We almost never get CW to come on, and I would love to hear why CW felt he should come on.
Well, it's because I was here. That's why. Just saying. Let's just keep it real.
Yeah, I mean, I am a lover of Chad. There's no question about that. Yeah, a lot of people know I have my own experience being excommunicated from a local congregation. For me, it was a little bit different. Like it started with being very reluctant to join the church and being kind of wooed and courted into that. And I had sort of said that, and this might have been a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I had said, almost half joking, that if they let me join the church, they'd end up excommunicating me. That sort of didn't happen, but it started like with me having questions about the intellectual tradition, the theological points that I had subscribed to formally as a function of this thing that was called the member affirmation of faith. And so I was not at the, kind of like Sam's saying with his scientific study there, I wasn't at the level of overt rejection of any of these doctrines. I just wasn't sure that I could have explicit assent to them anymore. So I was in a kind of agnostic place.
You had the problem of too much thinking and learning.
Pretty much, yeah. Well, in my case, it was specifically related to doctrine of Scripture, although that did eventually extend into questions of historical orthodoxy writ large. But the struggle that I had was in my little Presbyterian congregation, there were no elders who were conversant in the issues at the level of detail that I was thinking about them.
Imagine that.
Yeah, and so it wasn't like we couldn't even have a meaningful conversation about it, and so it just reached this sort of impasse where I had this endless accumulation of greater and more intense questions, and there was just silence on the other side, on the side of the leadership. And so I begged them to just, because I felt that it violated my conscience to formally assent to these ideas that I did not have deep-rooted convictions about. And so I begged them to just let me continue in the life of the church, but drop the formal membership. That's really all that I wanted. Paul's smirking because I don't know why, but maybe because he knows that it doesn't quite work that way. But below, go ahead.
Well, again, this pattern of propositional assent has been a very effective way of forming community. And I know both you, CW, and Sam are better educated in certain areas than the vast majority of clergy that you're going to bump into. And that's a difficulty, given that very traditional and effective form of community building. And the fact that your random clergy on some given corner that's close to Sam or CW's house or in their city stumbles on this, not necessarily surprising, because no local clergy is going to be expert in now the range of pluralities that we have in any given urban area. This is a vast difference from what my grandfather faced as a minister in, let's say, rural America during the Depression.
And I think that part of this is that churches are struggling with how to integrate expertise into their hierarchies, especially Protestant ones. Because, I mean, it used to be that in order to be the sort of person who learned about these things, you had to go through the formal education of the system. And probably the only way that that was happening to you is if you were on the path to become clergy, or if you were very wealthy, in which case you already had your own position in the hierarchy of, that. And I think that part of the Protestant Reformation was the problem of autodidacts, right? What happens now that we have that books are cheaper and that the standard of living is higher and literacy is more common, such that we have people teaching themselves outside of the formal structures where we used to be able to integrate the smartest people. And so you would never have the problem of having someone smarter than the clergy or more educated than the clergy, because there's no path to become educated without becoming the clergy.
Servetus.
Yeah, and Michael Servetus was of that. He was a literal Renaissance man's autodidact in, every subject, right? And that was the problem, is that, and this is, I think, all the more common now in the internet age, and, where most of us get educated completely outside the church, even now on theology. And I think that theoretically, if Sam is super teaching himself about these subjects, he should be rising in the status hierarchy of his church, such that it never is the problem that there's someone above him in that is less educated and making a decision over him.
So funny enough, I think this goes back to where we started with the Yanuka, because that is actually what I think is the beauty within Judaism. That I found it like when I started asking what a posek is, which is a senior rabbi, I'm like, okay, how do you become a posek? And people kind of said, well, you get smicha and then you get dayanut, but that doesn't really make you a posek. It is a question of people recognizing, okay, Chezi knows more Torah than I do. Yosef knows more Torah than I do. And in some instances, I know more Torah than they do. And when you get a child prodigy like the Yanuka, right, as a 40-year-old, like the other rabbis are in fact willing to admit, okay, this is somebody who knows more than I do. And that sort of just willing to bow to greater knowledge and greater, not just knowledge, I have to say. I mean, if
propositional knowledge.
It's a part of it.
It's a big part of it.
Huh. I think I am constantly pushing back against the people who their response to propositional tyranny is some sort of anti-propositionalism that says propositions are worthless. And it's like, no. That you can't go that far. Propositions matter. And that's part of why I think Sam should start his own church as opposed to trying to get these idolaters to accept him.
I wanna follow up on that, and this also relates to Charlie. So Charlie, you were talking about earlier before you cut off that you maybe want to go into a leadership position, right? And now you're also hearing Pastor Paul talk about how clergy, right, is not going to be able to handle someone like Sam or CW. Now, Charlie, you're sitting down, and on the Discord, you talk about the list of books that you want to be reading, and you're listening, and you're reading, and you're on the and you are slowly but surely turning yourself into one of those people that modern day clergy is not
to autodidact. Yeah,
right, is not going to be able to contain with, and then or maintain, and then won't be able to contain. But then you also want to be in a leadership position. So this also relates to what Jacob was saying right now about opening up your own church, Sam. Then I guess how does that look like? And it also goes to Paul. Like, is Sam supposed to be like, toe the line? Or is it like, no, like be like Icarus and fly? Well, not 2 flies to the sun. But I'm just saying, like, get out there. Make your own thing, and potentially 100 years down the line, 200 years down the line, you're going to be like, oh, Saint Sam, he taught us about XYZ, but I mean, like, what is Charlie supposed to think hearing that most clergy are not equipped for this new world?
But now, hold on. Okay, so let's say Sam decides he wants to start his own church. Now, Sam might give week after week after week of amazing articulations in the defense of biblical Unitarianism. But Sam is also going to have to be competent on the rest of the areas, and not only Sam, but the community he gathers around him, because then the next question is going to be, what kind of children's ministry does Sam have? What's Sam's theology of the Eucharist?
I've got someone who can work in the nursery, though.
Well, he's got someone that can work in the nursery. Well, whether she wants to be in the nursery every single week. How close is Sam to my house? See, part of the thing is that in real life, churches work on all of these layers. And this is a big part of Sam's difficulty, because on one hand, you say, okay, biblical Unitarian, there are some groups in Chicago that I can go to, so I can be a part of them. But where are they geographically? What are the people like there? Maybe there's a child molester in the nursery at the Biblical Unitarian Church. I mean, there are so many aspects of what goes on to actually instantiate a real life community that there are going to be hierarchies in which these things function. And because there's, especially in an urban area, there's so much available to us, we actually struggle with just how difficult this is. I'm often in conversation with people who live in rural areas where there are very few churches available. And I'll tell you, the number of aspects that go into what we want from a church, there's a lot of those. And generally speaking, let's say a leader of that community is often going to be a generalist because they might not be an expert in the details of Nicene Trinitarianism, which is why they tend to clump up with other groups, have a hierarchy, have a denomination, and that's why this whole thing works the way it does.
This makes me think of C.S. Lewis being kind of the smartest guy in the room at his church, and like kind of having to deal with some of that. Like, not everybody that is well read or an autodidact who can like read circles around, you know, the leader is probably well equipped to even be the leader. You know, like most of the people probably couldn't even keep up, and they'd probably just get burnt out or something like that. That'd be my guess.
Interestingly, Lewis didn't even think of himself as a theologian. And, you know, assuming he went to church in Oxford, I'm sure there were, no shortage of area-type ministers in his charge there.
But, like, and just to add to Paul's complexity, right? Competent in building institutions is not always going to come with competence in theological writing, right? And so, if you have a disconnect there, what are you going to do? Are you going to force, are you going to force very educated people to flounder in starting churches? So this is why you have the structures to handle all of that.
So this is where it goes back to Martin Luther being the source of all evil.
Okay.
Which is this idea of the priesthood of all members of the entire church, right?
But that's what Eric just said today. Eric just said that in his video today. He's a Catholic. He said everybody's called to priesthood.
Yes and no. I mean, obviously, there's a priesthood in the...
And isn't all the members of Israel, in certain sense, a priest?
In a certain sense.
Oh, okay. And interesting.
No, seriously. It is recognizing, and this goes back to my discussion with Father Stephen DeYoung and his ideas about Paul within Judaism, because he is reinterpreting Paul of Tarsus as being within Judaism and actually understanding, and Father Eric says ministerial priesthood is different than baptismal priesthood. Understanding that different people have different roles within the church. I'm constantly quoting 1 Corinthians 12, right? And if you're willing to have theologians, if you're willing to accept some people do X and some people do Y, and those are different, then it's not as much of a problem as what you get in these egalitarian churches.
But decision-making always requires a hierarchy.
Or a very small number of people.
For a very small number of people. And that's what's I mean, the whole point about Peterson and Peugeot is that action in the real world requires decision and all of this. And a while ago during the seeker movement, they did a lot of surveying about let's look at the if we're going to measure church size by success, seminary education was a negative indicator of pastoral success. In other words, Protestant clergy with less theological formation grew bigger churches that outperformed, in some ways, clergy that had been through everything. Now, it's easy to laugh at that, Jacob. But when you come to Living Stones and you see no children, well, that's deficient. Those point out my deficiencies. I was not able to turn this church around. And when people say, "Well, if I lived in Sacramento, I'd come to your church," it's like, combinatorial explosiveness with respect to any given local church. Does your church have a youth ministry? No. Does your church have a nursery right now? No. Does your church have a nice welcoming facility? No. How's the church's music program? How's Paul's preaching, for Pete's sake? So there's a lot to this, and any instantiation that can actually arrive at something that seems successful, that in some ways is able to scale multi-generationally, scale this way, has something to be said for it, even heterodox movements, let's say, like the Latter-day Saints. So reality is enormously complex.
Jacob, I would just piggyback on that and say I've recently, the last few weeks, have been going to this new synagogue. I'm anyways going to be leaving Jerusalem in around like a year and a half, but I'm trying out this new community. And this new community is supposed to be a mixture of what they call, let's say, serious modern Orthodox or religious Zionist Jews, and more of the ultra-Orthodox American, no, like yeshivish, like a Jew from America that's living in Israel right now, and sort of have them praying together. However, in the synagogue, they were having a Purim party right now, and there was a committee that was talking about what's going to be on this Purim festival. And there was a discussion if, for the women, there was going to be a women's reading of the Esther portion. And there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing. There shouldn't be a real issue with this. However, the more conservative members of the community wouldn't hear of this at all. And then there's this young rabbi, that is really coming from a more, I would say, a more progressive background. However, he is really trying to maintain this balance, and it's a really good show for me, because in this new community that I'm going to be moving to, there's talks about an egalitarian synagogue, and the majority of those going to be a Orthodox community. And are they going to be able to work together, both, curbing their own interests in certain extents, and create that balance? So I'm very sensitive to what Pastor Paul is saying about, on the ground there's a reality which forces something ultimately. And back to Sam and his conversation with the elders, they're saying, like, listen, that's great and you're awesome, but we're really trying to maintain something over here. And Father Eric has 400, what did he say, 400 or 500 youths in his youth group, and that's, they look at that as success, and maybe they look at Sam as, this is too controversial for us. This starts shaking this this thing that we have going.
So let me ask you a question that I know doesn't always fall along the lines that it should, but in the Sephardic way used to, and I would like to see happen again, which was, if somebody comes to your synagogue who obviously knows Shas and Poskim, let's say he is the Yenuka, right? And he knows all of Shas and Poskim far better than anybody else. And he says, this is allowed or this is not allowed, right? He's he binds and loosens on earth as it is in heaven, right? Are the people going to accept? And I mean, this goes back to Rabbi Eliezer, right? And our people are going to be like, oh, you know what? This guy knows Shas and Poskim in ways that I don't know. And despite the fact that I'm one of these modern nebuchs who believes in women of the wall and all that bullshit, I am going to accept somebody who knows more Torah than I do, and simply go with it.
So I just to reiterate what Jacob is saying, and if that question is to me, I'll answer it. But will you be able to identify the authority when it's standing in front of you? And this is true. There's a joke that goes about, like, when the Messiah would come, there's still groups within Judaism is going to be like, the size of his hat is not big enough, and like, I don't know, like, it's still like all these challenges will still be there. So, and again, this sort of goes back to, Sam, should you open up your own church? I don't know, like, if you're looking around and you're seeing that the saints and sages and church fathers that you look up to at a certain point of time were controversial, or were people were running after them, were saying they're talking complete nonsense. But I don't know. It is tough because, like, in the synagogue, for example, it wouldn't be enough that. Like, I could see that they're uncomfortable when I talk to them about specific code in Judaism, and they're like, okay, it's not fun that this guy knows to answer our questions because it's just uncomfortable right now because we're still going to disagree with you. So it doesn't matter if you're pointing out a specific line. That's just not the way we do things. And then you're sort of left in this, like, awkward space. And then I think to myself,
this is the problem with modern Orthodoxy. This is why I couldn't take modern Orthodoxy seriously. They wanted a certain answer, and it didn't matter that the answer wasn't something you could get out of Shas and Poskim.
And so, I mean, Jacob, part of what you're also saying, inherent in the vote with your feet model working, right, in Judaism, where people find, oh, this person knows their stuff, I'm going to go over and listen to this guy, is inherent in that is the idea that individuals can recognize it. Or maybe not infallibly, but, right, like, on the whole, democracy of the voting based off of the distributability of the larger populace to all individually recognize these things is going to be valuable and productive. And that's sort of what I think that Luther really meant by the priesthood of all believers, was something along those sorts of lines, whereas a highly clerical system might sometimes deny that gifting being distributed among the common people.
Among the common people, look, the fact is, I mean, this is a common saying in Orthodox Jewish synagogues, I don't know how tall the mountains are, right? Ma li lechnis roshit ben hahari. Who am I to stick my head in between the mountains, right? And so, that's a real thing that I have to consider. Like, yesterday, I was at Rabbi Davidi's house, who is a very, very prominent rabbi here in Los Angeles, and he obviously knows far more than I do, far more than I do, and we have very real disagreements. And the question becomes, at what point do I have to say, okay, so Rabbi Wagner knows more than I do, and Rabbi Shochat knows more than I do, and Rabbi Davidi knows more than I do, and how do I choose between them? And in Judaism, the fact is, we have this idea that, okay, this person's a posek. This person is obviously at a level that even if I disagree with him, even if I go to a different synagogue, like, that person, if Rabbi Breitowitz says you're allowed to smoke marijuana, No, but I can't imagine anybody within Orthodox Judaism saying somebody who goes to Rabbi Breidowitz's, and not that he ever said this, but somebody who goes to Rabbi Breidowitz's synagogue isn't allowed to smoke marijuana because Rabbi Breidowitz has those shoulders. And we recognize there are people who have such shoulders that they can, in fact, decide what is allowed and not allowed.
Now, this gets really complex because if you listen to your language, and we hear this all the time on the internet, they're really smart. Okay, what does that mean? They know more than I do. What does that mean? Part of what happens, let's say, when you look at, let's say, the miracles of Jesus, Jesus was known as a miracle worker. Whether or not you believe those things happened, a big piece of that is that sort of mastery impresses us. Now, there's even people working on that and saying, well, it can't just be miracles. And fair enough, because we got a lot of this in Protestantism too. It's an enormously complex matrix that goes into the question of authority. And you, Jacob, when we had lunch, the first lunch we had today, when you were talking about the Rebbe and how you so wish that you could have been part of that community when the Rebbe was there. And when you read what he writes, he speaks as one with authority to your heart, and your heart strangely warms. And I could put all kinds of things in this. Even the language that we use about someone being really smart or knowing a lot, even all of that language is insufficient to us because we actually have an intuitive sense that what we're looking for, obviously, to me, is God and the Son of God and the presence of God and the kingdom of God, because those are global ideas, the likes of which there's combinatorial explosiveness in there, the likes of which we can't fully get our arms around. And when we, in fact, encounter them, we fall to our knees and then serve them. And all of this is part of that process. And so even though we use all of these little ways of saying they're smart or they're holy or all of these things, even all of this language is still very much sort of a rough approximation for what we're trying to get into. And so, there is an idolatry of theological accuracy. And I've seen this in my own denomination for a long time. And part of the reason I call that an idolatry is because, like all idolatries, it's a reduction of that which cannot be reduced into one particular aspect and level. And that isn't to say that theological accuracy is unimportant or theological articulation is unimportant. All of these things have importances. That's how idolatries work, is that all of these things need to stay in their proper place. And so this is the sort of wrestling we're doing. And now we live in a world, thank God, where we can, in fact, and this is an enormous achievement in humanity, we can, in fact, commune across all of these different lines that for centuries upon centuries people have been shedding blood over. That we're having difficulty should come as no surprise. That we're understanding each other as well as we are, that's the miracle. That's a wonderful thing. And what we're doing with conversations like these and groups like these and huddles like this is hopefully, in ways that we can't even articulate, begin to level up. Now, each of us, of course, can only imagine ourselves leveling up within the stack that we have received. Every now and then someone makes a big transition and they'll go from sort of one stack to another. But we're trying to level up in the stack that we've received. We're trying to grow from each other. That's why Father DeYoung comes on your channel. And this is the process that we're doing. And, and that's why all of your bombastic articulations about Martin Luther or Protestantism, and people take those things seriously. And so, like Nate, I'm not going to talk to Jacob. Okay, fair enough. He doesn't have to talk to you. You don't have to talk to him. Part of the reason I talk to both of you is because I believe that I learn from both of you. And I think, in fact, what you have to give me makes me stronger, better, and I believe in that sense, hopefully, closer to God.
Right. And I appreciate your
Amen.
yes, amen, for sure. And like, there's two things going on there. Like with the example of Jacob not talking to Nate Heil, there's always going to be a necessity to prune down the combinatorial explosiveness that we have. So I'm not going to investigate Islam. I'm not going to investigate the Dante chair. Like all of these things, right? And the I I appreciate that you expanded beyond Jacob's emphasis on authority, because one thing I am wrestling with right now is that I have Sam and Jacob and you, Paul, and Father Stephen, and all of these people who, from my perspective, are all epistemically on the same level. They're all peers. But then how do I choose which one to follow, right? And it's something like we're handed these stacks, and we have to go with the providence of God to rely on that. And I think that's why Hezi will say to me, keep going to Mass, Richard, that's a beautiful thing, right? Where, like, I hear him say that, but I'm still stressed in my heart that I haven't investigated all of the accusations Jacob has against Paul churches. Or that I haven't investigated all of the things that Sam has to say about Trinitarianism. Like, that causes stress within me. But somehow, some way, I still have to live out in a stack. And it was a big turning point in my life where when I heard Jonathan Peugeot says to Rationality Rules, I forget his name, not Stephen. Anyway, when Jonathan said to Rationality Rules, where are you standing such that you're able to make these judgments? Like, that was like, okay, I have to stand somewhere to make the judgments between all of these different epistemic peers that I'm dealing with. And yes, maybe I will jump stack eventually. But there is no stackless plan from which I can adjudicate all of the things, like with total what's your phrase, Paul? The monarchical vision. There is no stackless monarchical vision from which I can adjudicate all of these stacks. And I think that has the realization of that has led us to this moment where we are able to communicate cross stack, and we are able to respect each other with the realization that, okay, we have to be in a stack, and there are improvements that we can make to all of our staff, but you have to be in one, right? And that's what is bringing about the respect that I think we're finding in this moment.
I would.
What's the
Go ahead.
what do you guys think the root of our collective problem is?
That
Which collective problem?
I mean, yeah,
Well-
I think the root of it is that, like, due to the Enlightenment and globalization, we've realized the diversity of staff. Like that, at least that's what I'm at with it.
What I have noticed is there are a lot of people who. So I've taken to saying my beliefs when I was 35 are not the same beliefs as I have now. and they're not the same beliefs as I had 25 when I was 25 or 15 or 5, and that should be really obvious. Yet there are plenty of people who feel a fear that their beliefs now are not the same ones they had at 25, certainly, and oftentimes at 15. And it's like there is a fear of growth which admits that your former self was wrong, which says your current self is going to be wrong, right? So at 55, am I going to look back at Jacob at 45 and say, oh, cringe, like, why was he saying those things? I hope so. And that's not a
Why
hope
wait?
a lot of people have.
Well, so this was central to Max Weber's argument about re-enchanting Western thought, because he said there was a profound disincentive for working scientists to get into a specialized discipline, because if they really embraced the critical ethos of science, they had to acknowledge exactly what you're saying, Jacob, which is that I'm going to be wrong. If I make a substantial contribution that is really significant, it might stand for 100 years, but it can't stand for 1,000 years. And so there's this kind of difficulty confronting the nihilism of how do I devote myself to the passion that is required to pursue at the level of detail that specialization demands whatever it is I'm passionate about. How do I maintain the passion and yet balance it with the need for self-worth and individual significance? And so I think that's where, like, re-enchanting and all of this, these categories that Weber introduces into the lexicon loom large over all our conversation.
I think it's also, many of us are exiles of one form or another. If you just look on this group, I don't know about Chezi, how much he's in exile, but that's what we hear a lot of. We have, I think Jacob just described it very well. We know that to one degree or another, we know that our institutional fittedness is insufficient for what we desire, and so we are seekers in that way, and we continue then to try to create institutions, mold institutions, create and mold communities, and what we've discovered is that it's pretty good working together. It's much better working together than being alone.
So people in the comments are trying to find a poetic way of expressing this, and on my pilgrimage, one piece of scripture that really kept on coming forward, in Jewish Bibles, it's just Malachi 3. In Christian Bibles, it's Malachi 3 and 4, which is, it talks about the burning sun that is going to come, and it's going to heal the righteous and burn away the wicked. And it's the same sun, right? It's that painful sun which is the refining, smelting heat, which takes away that part of you which is ungodly. And
the love of God is the same thing as the judgment of God.
Yes. So Malachi 3 and 4, I highly recommend.
A lot of this conversation.
This is why I find it.
I was going to say, a lot of this conversation to me sounds like in Judaism you would say Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God, and we have built into our system the 70 faces of the Torah. and that allows you to play around with, so to speak, 70 stacks, where you know that you're placed within them, and you can, in a certain sense, pick and choose between them, which allows you to have this doubtful stability, because you could constantly be moving through and gliding through these stacks. And I guess, again, in Christianity, or when I'm thinking Sam having this conversation, I would want him to be able to have that flexibility of gliding on those stacks, and them seeing that as like, this is another stack that we could glide on. But specifically in this conversation here, I think about the verse in Zephaniah about speaking to God in one accord, because that's how that conversation happens. But connecting to the verse in Malachi, when I think of the son, to me, I see Sam having a conversation that is requiring him to sort of rip off a peel and be exposed to a certain sun, but in a certain sense do that to the elders in front of him. But I don't know if they necessarily want to be exposed to that, or see that is another vantage point of having the conversation of what God is, because seemingly Sam is managing to balance both, in a certain sense, the Trinitarian mind theology and his own. However, can we do that dance all together, like where we have Raj on this scene and Jacob is talking to Raj? He is taking Raj's words and then sort of seeing them, in his own Jewish oculus, and seeing how that relates to have that common conversation. So I sort of want the elders to dig deeper and see, when Sam is saying this, how can we still, in our own stack, relate to that?
But Sam's elders are also responsible for the people.
That's true. That's true.
As much as, even if Sam's elders were willing to, let's say, go deep with Sam about the kinds of conflicts that happened within Christianity within the first 1,000 years, a lot of those, they're concerned for the families, the marriages, the stability, and all of anybody who's responsible for a community knows that is, whether it's a Christian community or other communities, that's a holy calling. Because, in Christian terms, I just preached on, what Jesus says about causing little ones to stumble. Christians ought to take that very seriously. And so they, make a calculation that as much as they perhaps might like Sam, they're worried. And that's these things then come up.
I mean, there's a lot of dogmatic creep, though, in Christian churches, right? So I mean, I think that, so Hezi, I'm very interested in the themes that you, I think, perennially raise here, and on two fronts. So I'm interested in the ecumenical question. So getting together with Christians and saying, well, what the hell is this Christianity thing anyway? And secondly, so that whatever that is, we can then meaningfully bring it into dialogue with genuinely diverse alternative perspectives. And yeah, I think that we're at a pretty interesting moment that is perilous, but also promising for people like me and Sam, for the self-didacts of the world. And, I'll speak from my own Christian vantage point. The Christian intellectual tradition is a phrase that I coined for myself to refer to the sum total of theological output within this broad phenomenon, religious phenomenon of Christianity. Part of the difficulty is there wasn't a way to think of it that way. So Christianity is often synonymous within its traditions, of which it's not monolithic by any means, right? But it's often synonymous with a particular theological vantage point. And that's the kind of theological hegemony that is a hangover of the imperialism of Christendom that Christianity, especially intellectually, but not exclusively, is still trying to get over. And so even meaningfully asking the question of what is Christianity is extremely fraught, because you're immediately confronted with which Christianity, which theology. And so we're, I mean, so it's like we don't even think of there as being a thing as the Christian intellectual tradition. I think there is, but most of us can't even think of it that way. But once you even get to that point, you know, a lot of problems are unresolved. So like the past 200 years of historical critical scholarship, for example, that, you know, that was inaugurated, like so many of these things in Protestantism anyway, and I do speak as a Protestant, you know, the German scholasticism is really setting the agenda for the Christian intellectual situation. But here in the Anglosphere, you know, most of us don't speak German. There's been a kind of slow trickle-down effect. And as all of these monolithic developments in German Protestantism make their way into the academy in different parts of the world, they hit different modes of Christian tradition, and then they get refracted in all kinds of crazy different ways. And you see this in a lot of N.T. Wright's writings. But I mean, I would say that like even something simple like the last 200 years of historical scholarship into the origins of Christianity has not really been absorbed by Christianity as a whole. And so the promise and the peril for thoughtful people today is, yeah, you can actually meaningfully engage with these issues now. And, you know, we have an opportunity to move the ball in Christian theology. And, you know, theology may very well be at the bottom of this, because there's like the sort of academics who deal with all this stuff first, and then it kind of moves down to the artists, and then it goes into popular culture, and then it's like religion in its organized form. That's like the last to change. Go ahead.
I would just say that you also have to throw in that equation how social media sort of disrupts that, how that makes it out to the masses. But I think, you know, like you said, moving the ball forward, I think that's true about Judaism as well to a certain extent. And that relates to the larger question, which is, you know, how do, let's say, Jacob and I see this space or see sort of this conversation with Christians? I mean, and again, I see it as also, I see it possible for me to have this conversation because of the vantage point and where I am being in Israel. But that sort of to me is where the next step is, because there is this monolith called Christianity. And now I am getting like a sense or a little dip into the waters. I'm having this panel in front of me right now, have this kind of conversation. And, you know, I see it's like you just said, it's still digesting this, you know, its own understanding about itself. And I think that, again, those are very exciting times because clearly this is a divine movement. And I think Jacob would agree with that statement. And because of that, it is so important that it also knows how to recognize itself for what it is. While I have my own thoughts, I would say like the jury's the jury's out still on that about what that's going to end up manifest. But again, hearing Sam, those to me are little percolations of Christianity itself is having a conversation with how it identifies itself. It's seemingly to me, it's because we ourselves as Jews need to better understand, and Jacob and I have generally a more progressive and open conversation at times about how we see Judaism and Christianity working together. But it requires both morphing of Judaism and of Christianity.